In a small monastery nestled among mist-covered mountains, there lived a young monk named Rio. Since his arrival at the monastery, he had learned many teachings about life, but one troubled him deeply. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. One afternoon, while walking through the monastery garden, he sat next to the ancient oak tree that had witnessed hundreds of winters. Its leaves slowly fell, carrying with them the remnants of the previous season. Rio sat in silence, feeling the weight of his thoughts. An elderly monk, known for his wisdom, approached him. It was Master Kaizen, who always seemed to understand what others were thinking, even without words. "Why so thoughtful, young Rio?" asked the master with a penetrating gaze. Rio sighed. "Master, I have always heard that pain is inevitable, but I struggle to understand how I can prevent it from becoming suffering. With each step, I feel that pain accompanies me, but how do I choose not to suffer?" The master smiled gently and, after a pause, began to speak. "Pain, dear monk, is like rain. We cannot stop it from falling. But what we decide to do with the rain, whether we let it soak our clothes or seek shelter, that is up to us." Rio looked at the master, intrigued, hoping the elderly monk's words would offer him a deeper understanding. Master Kaizen continued, watching as the raindrops began to gently fall over the garden. "The rain is like pain," he said. "It comes without warning, without us being able to control it. But what really defines our path is how we react to it. If we decide to stay under the storm, soaking ourselves to the bone and letting the cold penetrate us, then we will suffer. But if we learn to accept the rain as it is, without clinging to it, then we can find peace." Rio frowned, still not fully understanding. "Accepting pain without it affecting us? Is that what it means to not suffer?" Kaizen nodded slowly. "Yes, but acceptance does not mean indifference. It means being aware of what happens without letting our emotions attach to it. Pain arrives, but we don't need to carry it beyond its moment. It's like a cloud passing through the sky. You didn't cling to it when it disappears, did you?" Rio looked up at the sky, feeling the cool breeze surrounding him. "How can I learn to let go of pain in that way?" Master Kaizen, with a warm smile, pointed to a nearby stream. "Come, I will show you something." Rio followed him silently to the edge of the stream, where the water flowed calmly. "Observe the water," said the master. "Do you see how it flows without resistance? Sometimes, water encounters obstacles on its path, but it never stops. It adapts, it accommodates, but it never gets stuck in the obstacle. In the same way, pain will be an obstacle in your life. What matters is not stopping to mourn it or holding on to it." Rio nodded, beginning to understand. "Is this what it means to live in the present moment?" "Exactly," replied the master. "The present moment is all we have. Pain is a part of that moment, but it is not all that we are. If you identify with the pain, it becomes suffering. If you allow it and let it pass, it will simply be another experience on your path." Rio closed his eyes, feeling the breeze and the sound of the water. For the first time, something inside him relaxed. Pain no longer seemed so frightening. The next morning, Rio woke up early, determined to practice what he had learned. As he walked along the path that surrounded the monastery, his thoughts were calm, but the weight of the pain still lingered in his heart. He remembered the recent loss of a loved one, a wound that had left a deep mark, though he did not show it. The rain of life seemed unceasing. At that moment, the young monk saw a familiar figure at the end of the path. It was the elderly Master Kaizen, who was waiting by an old, sturdy tree. This tree, with its thick trunk and branches stretching towards the sky, was a symbol of strength in the monastery. "Master, here you are," said Rio, approaching with respect. Yesterday, you spoke to me about the flowing water, but today I feel that the pain is still present, as if it were part of me. The master smiled gently and pointed to the tree. Look at this tree, Rio. It has lived through many seasons, faced storms, droughts, and strong winds. Yet it remains here, deeply rooted in the earth. The pain has not destroyed its existence, but it has shaped it. The branches that bend with the wind straighten again and again. Rio observed the tree closely, noticing how the branches swayed with the breeze without breaking. How its leaves, though worn by time, remained green and firm. The tree doesn't fight against the wind, Rio said, slowly understanding. Exactly, said Kaizen. The tree knows that the wind will come, and instead of resisting it, it adapts to it. If the tree decided to fight the wind, its branches would break. But by accepting it, the tree continues to grow. Rio felt a faint flash of understanding. Is that what I must do with the pain? Let it pass without fighting it. Yes, replied the master. Pain is part of life, like the wind to the tree. If you resist it, you will only create more suffering. If you let it flow, it will allow you to grow stronger. The key is not to cling to it, but to accept it as something temporary, a part of the natural process. Rio observed the tree for a few more moments, letting the master's words sink deeply into his being. The wind blew gently, and he understood that pain, like the wind, was inevitable, but it did not have to be his master. He could learn to be like the tree, rooted in peace, flexible in the face of adversity. Thank you, master, whispered Rio, with a new light in his eyes. Always remember, said Kaizen before leaving, pain does not define you. What defines you is how you choose to live with it. In the following days, Rio meditated on the teachings of Master Kaizen. He walked through the garden, watching the seasons change, the wind rising, and the leaves falling. Each day, the pain he felt from the loss of his loved one was still there, like a shadow following him in silence. But he was beginning to understand that, like the wind and the tree, he could choose how to relate to it. One day, Master Kaizen invited him to take a walk through the fields surrounding the monastery. As they walked in silence, Rio noticed how the rice fields, with their green stalks, swayed gently to the rhythm of the wind. In the distance, a horizon full of mountains faded into the mist. Master, now I understand what you taught me about the tree, Rio began. Pain is inevitable, but I don't have to cling to it. However, how can I be sure that I am not avoiding the pain? How can I know that I am not suppressing what I feel? Master Kaizen looked at him with serenity and said, It's not about avoiding pain, Rio. It's about how you integrate it into your life. Suffering arises when we cling to pain, when we identify with it and let it define our existence. Pain can be a lesson, an opportunity to grow, but only if we allow it to be there without letting it control us. Rio thought about those words as they walked through the fields. At that moment, a gust of wind passed through him, making his robe flutter and his hair move gently. He felt a slight discomfort, but this time he didn't fight it. Instead, he allowed the wind to pass, and with it, a sense of peace began to fill his heart. Pain, just like this wind, is not something to fear, Rio reflected quietly. It is just a part of life. Exactly, nodded Kaizen. What matters is not the wind or the pain, but how you choose to be present with them. If you resist, you suffer. If you accept them, you are free. Life keeps flowing, and you decide whether you become part of that flow or stay stuck. Rio, feeling a new understanding, closed his eyes for a moment and let the wind caress his face. In that instant, he realized that there was no need to cling to sadness or pain. He could live with them without letting them define his inner peace. Suffering was just a choice, and he was ready to choose serenity. As the days passed, Kaizen's teachings settled more deeply in Ryo's heart. He began to notice that the small daily annoyances, which would have previously caused him frustration or suffering, now passed through his life like the wind through the branches of a tree. He had learned to be aware of the pain, but not to cling to it. He accepted its presence without letting it take over his being. One afternoon, while meditating in his cell, a sudden call interrupted his tranquility. The younger monk, Sora, ran to his door with a look of alarm. "Ryo, there's something you need to see," he said, breathing quickly. Curious, Ryo stood up and followed Sora to the center of the monastery. There, a group of monks had gathered around a bent figure, covered in dust and mud. It was a traveler, clearly exhausted, with a bleeding wound on his leg. "This man has suffered greatly," explained one of the older monks. "We found him in the forest, near the mountain. His journey was long, and now he is too weak to continue." Ryo observed the man and felt a shiver. It was not only the physical pain that he saw on his face, but also the pain of a life filled with struggle. The traveler seemed to have been defeated by his own suffering, as if his soul were as wounded as his body. Master Kaizen appeared among the crowd and calmly approached the man. "Come, brother," he said, extending his hand. "Here you will find refuge. Pain is a part of life, but you do not need to carry it alone." Ryo watched in silence as Master Kaizen guided the man to a safe place where he could rest. The traveler, though clearly exhausted, seemed relieved by the warmth of the gesture. The other monks began to clean his wound while Kaizen sat beside him and began speaking softly. Curious, Ryo approached, but Kaizen raised a hand to stop him. "Sometimes," the master said softly, "suffering becomes an obstacle not just because of the pain it causes us, but because of how we cling to it. This man has lived through so much pain, but he still has the opportunity to choose not to be consumed by it." Ryo looked at the man, noticing how his face, though marked by exhaustion, softened at the master's words. "How do we do that, master?" Ryo asked quietly. Kaizen looked him in the eyes and replied, "With compassion and acceptance. Pain is inevitable, but suffering comes when we resist life as it is. By accepting pain, we do not deny it or ignore it, but we do not allow ourselves to be trapped by it. The key lies in how we respond, how we accompany it without being swept away by it." Ryo felt a deep resonance in those words. He understood that he not only had to practice accepting pain in his own life, but also learn to accompany others in their pain, without imposing an additional burden of suffering. Just as the wind caresses the tree without breaking it, he could offer his presence and compassion to those who suffered without trying to fix everything. That night, as he prepared to sleep, Ryo felt at peace. He knew that pain would continue to come, but he also understood that, like the wind, there would always be a space for acceptance, understanding, and serenity. And with each step, he grew closer to the freedom of living fully, without allowing himself to be defined by what he could not control. Time continued to flow at the monastery, and Ryo found himself increasingly immersed in the practice of acceptance. However, one afternoon, while meditating by a stream, a new concern began to grow in his mind. Although he had learned to deal with pain, he sometimes felt that his mind was filled with thoughts that kept him trapped in the past, reliving the wounds over and over again. He realized that, although he was not actively suffering from the pain, he was still carrying the weight of the memory. He got up from his seat and went to seek out Master Kaizen. He found him in the monastery garden, watching the flowers blooming under the afternoon sun. "Master," Ryo began, "I have been practicing the acceptance of pain, but now I feel that my mind is still trapped in the past, reliving the wounds over and over again. Sometimes it seems like I will never be able to free myself from those memories. How can I let go of the pain if my mind keeps remembering? Kaizen looked at him serenely and said, "Ah, young Rio, what you describe is the trap of the ego. The ego feeds on the identity we create with our experiences. Every time we remember the pain, the ego clings to that story and makes us believe that we are the suffering we have lived. But in reality, suffering is not who you are. It is just a temporary experience that passes like a cloud in the sky." Rio looked at him, trying to understand more deeply. "So how can I let go of those memories? How can I release what continues to cling to my mind?" Kaizen smiled and said, "Imagine that your mind is like the water in a lake. If we throw a stone, the ripples spread across the surface, but eventually, the water calms and the ripples disappear. The memory of pain is like that stone. At first, the ripples are large, but over time, if we stop throwing stones, the water will return to calm. The key is not to cling to those ripples, not to identify with them. Let them flow, without the need to analyze them or relive them over and over again." Rio reflected on the master's words. "But what if the pain is so strong that the ripples don't calm? What if I can't avoid continuing to remember?" Then, Kaizen responded, "It is important to remember that we are not fighting against the pain or the memories. The challenge is to see them without identifying with them. Memories can come, but we don't need to cling to them. When you stop fighting against what is, when you stop resisting, the ripples calm on their own." Rio closed his eyes and, for the first time, tried to observe his memories without clinging to them. He remembered the pain of loss, but in doing so, he chose not to identify with the suffering it had caused. The ripples in his mind began to calm, and for a few moments, peace enveloped him. He knew the pain was still there, but he also understood that, if he didn't cling to it, it could no longer control his inner peace. "Thank you, Master," Rio said, feeling deep gratitude. "I think I'm beginning to understand what it means to be free from suffering." Kaizen nodded and, with a peaceful smile, replied, "Remember, young Rio, the ego constantly seeks to cling to the past, but you are not the past. You are the one who observes, the one who chooses how to respond to what happens. Pain does not define you, and suffering only exists when you choose to stay trapped in it." Rio stayed there a little longer, meditating on those words, and as he returned to his cell, he realized that he was getting closer and closer to freeing himself from the trap of the ego. The days passed, and Rio continued practicing Master Kaizen's teachings with growing serenity. The peace he had begun to cultivate within himself took deeper root. However, the real challenge was not just accepting pain or memories, but facing the moments of intense anguish that still arose from time to time. Sometimes, when stillness settled in his heart, a surge of sadness would suddenly strike him, like an unexpected wave. One afternoon, while walking along a path in the monastery, Rio encountered one of the elder monks, Hashin, who was usually very reserved. The monk, though aged, had a steady gaze full of wisdom. Despite his usual silence, something in his face reflected deep bitterness. "Master Hashin," Rio said as he approached, "I've noticed that lately you seem troubled. Is there anything I can do for you?" Hashin looked at him for a long moment, as though assessing his words. Then, he sighed and replied, "Rio, you've learned much about accepting pain. But the real challenge comes when the pain transforms into something that seems like part of our identity, something we cannot easily let go of. I've walked that path too, but there's something I haven't achieved, transforming that pain into something that sets me free." Rio sat beside him, feeling renewed curiosity and empathy. How can we make the pain transform? How can we free ourselves from the identity the pain imposes on us? Hashin gazed toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. Pain itself is not what imprisons us. It's the way we interpret it, how we carry it inside, how we feed it with thoughts of, "I can't live with this," or "I'll never be free of it." Pain transforms when we accept it completely, when we stop seeing it as an enemy and begin to see it as a natural part of our lives. Rio nodded, but something still didn't click in his mind. And how do we stop seeing it as an enemy? How do we accept pain in a way that frees us? Hashin smiled softly. "Look at the river flowing there," he said, pointing to the nearby stream. "The water flows with strength, and sometimes it picks up stones along its way. The stones may resist the flow of the water, but the water never stops flowing. Over time, the stones are worn down, rounded, and integrated into the flow of the river. Pain, if we allow it, can be like those stones. Instead of resisting it, we can allow it to become part of our process, to integrate into our being without ceasing to flow." Rio watched the water with newfound understanding. Does that mean the pain can transform into something greater, something that doesn't cause us suffering? Exactly, Hashin said. Pain is not just suffering. It can be the fertile ground where our wisdom grows, where our compassion is cultivated. When we let pain pass, embrace it fully, it becomes part of us, but it doesn't define us. And when we learn to accept that part, we discover that we are much greater than the pain itself. Rio fell silent, meditating on these words. For a moment, he felt something inside him was transforming. The pain he had carried for so long was not something to avoid or reject. It was no longer a burden. It was a seed that, if cultivated properly, could bear fruits of understanding and inner peace. "Thank you, Master Hashin," Rio said finally, with a renewed light in his eyes. "I believe I now understand what it means to transform pain." Hashin nodded calmly. "Remember, young monk, we are not fighting against the pain. We are learning to flow with it, to integrate it into our lives so that it allows us to grow and be freed. And when we do, we discover that true freedom is not in avoiding pain, but in living with it without letting it control us." Rio looked at the river once more, feeling his heart fill with new clarity. He knew the journey was not yet complete, but for the first time, he felt ready to accept pain as a natural part of his journey, without clinging to it or allowing it to define him. Suffering was optional, and he had decided to live in the freedom of acceptance. Over time, Rio became a wiser monk, one who no longer lived marked by the suffering of the past, but who walked with the serenity of one who had accepted all the seasons of life, including pain. With each dawn, he found the opportunity to renew himself, and with each sunset, he learned to let go of what he could not change. His steps were firm and calm, knowing that the waves of pain would continue to come, but he no longer feared or resisted them. He simply let them flow. One afternoon, after a long day of meditation and teaching, Master Kaizen approached him. Without words, they sat together on the same bench under the old tree that had served as a witness to many of their conversations. "Rio," Kaizen began after a long silence, "you have walked a long path, and I see that you have learned to free yourself from the suffering that once weighed on you. You have understood that pain, though inevitable, does not need to define your life. You have let the wind pass without letting it dominate you, and you have found peace in acceptance." Rio smiled, the light of understanding shining in his eyes. "Thank you, Master. I've learned that pain can be part of life, but it doesn't have to own it. I've realized that suffering is just an option, one I no longer want to choose." Kaizen nodded in approval. True freedom, Rio, is not in escaping pain, but in learning to live with it without letting it become our burden. Now you are like the tree that does not fear the wind, like the river that flows without resisting. You have found inner peace. At that moment, Rio looked to the horizon, where the sun was slowly descending, painting the sky with warm and soft colors. The air was cool and still. He remembered everything he had learned: the acceptance of pain, the importance of not resisting, and how suffering only arose when clinging to what couldn't be controlled. "I think I finally understand, Master," Rio said, with a deep serenity in his voice. "Inner peace is not the absence of pain, but the absence of resistance to pain. It's the total acceptance of what life brings us, without it taking away our freedom." Kaizen smiled. "That's right, young monk. Pain will be part of your life, as it is for all human beings. But suffering is a choice. When you choose to accept pain as part of your journey, and not as an enemy, you discover true peace." Rio stayed there under the tree, watching as the long shadows of the evening gently touched the earth. He realized that he no longer sought to escape pain, nor avoid it. Instead, he became a witness to his life, a calm observer who accepted everything that came without letting it define him. Thus, in his heart, peace settled deeply, like a river flowing ceaselessly. Pain, though inevitable, ceased to be a burden. And with each breath, Rio knew that true freedom was not in escaping pain, but in living with it, without letting suffering control him. Life continued its course, and he, in his stillness, continued flowing with it. And so, Rio understood that while pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And in that understanding, he found the peace he had long sought.